We're not big fans of waiting for something to happen, are we? But whether we like it or not, much of life is waiting. In fact, statistics show that the average person spends close to an hour every day waiting for something to happen. Elevators, traffic lights, your turn at the intersection, waiting on a preacher to start preaching, or your turn to pay at the grocery store, or a cup of coffee, or a table, or your food at a restaurant, the computer to load, the microwave, which is supposed to keep us from waiting on the oven, waiting for your kids to get in the car. I swear most of the time it's like herding cats. I think about the sport of football. Most of us watched a football game a couple of weeks ago. And when you watch a football game on TV, most of the time, I don't know if you noticed this, but nothing happens. By rule, the actual game takes 60 minutes to play, but the average NFL telecast lasts 3 hours. So I read this article in the Wall Street Journal. In the average NFL telecast, the actual playing of football takes up a whopping, are you ready for this? 11 minutes. 11 minutes. And so if that's true, what happens the rest of the time? Well, if you watch Super Bowl 55, you'll know that there was this one scene. A man ran out onto the field, but the TV cameras quickly moved away from him. But what you might not know is that commentator Kevin Harlan called the whole scene, which was later added to video footage that they've got. So for your viewing pleasure, here it is.
Second down, 20, 5:03 to go. Someone has run on the field. Some guy with a brawl. And now he's not being chased. He's running down the middle, the 40. Arms in the air in a victory salute. He's pulling down his pants. Put up your pants, my man. Pull up those pants. He's being chased to the 30. He breaks a tackle from a security guard. The 20, down the middle, the 10, the 5. He slides at the 1, and they converge on him at the goal line. Pull up your pants, take off the bra, and be a man.
That was probably the most entertaining part of the Super Bowl. Of course, there was a lot of other things that happened, a lot of other waiting. 60 minutes for commercials, 75 minutes when the players are just kind of standing around, 17 minutes for replays. This is all according to that article. And after a few other miscellaneous things are thrown in, like crowd shots, talking heads in the booth, shots of cheerleaders or Super Bowl streakers, what you're left with is 11 minutes of actual football. And I take it as a parable of life itself. The action of life is small. The waiting is large. Waiting is perhaps the hardest discipline of the Christian life. See, most of us hate to wait. I know I do. We're used to our fast-paced culture. We have Amazon Prime same-day delivery. I can get on my phone right now. I could text my mother in Zimbabwe, Africa, and she'll receive it in a matter of seconds. We have all of these advancements that make it so that we don't have to wait because, well, we're impatient people. But whether we like it or not, waiting is still a part of life. You're probably waiting for something at this very moment. Maybe you're waiting for your grades, waiting to graduate, waiting to be accepted to college, waiting for your first job offer, waiting to see if the bank will give you that loan, waiting for the right time to start a family or when to be married, or waiting for someone to buy your house, waiting for your prayers to be answered, waiting for your daughter to come back to the Lord, waiting for a vaccination, waiting to retire. You see, the real problem isn't the waiting. It's what happens in our hearts while we wait. For too many of us, waiting creates this downward spiral of impatience and frustration and selfishness and anger in our hearts. While we're waiting in line, what we do is we find flaws with the people in front of us, do we not? Or while we're waiting in traffic, we get increasingly frustrated with those driving around us. And that carries over into the bigger areas of our lives. So the question then becomes, what do you do while you wait? We're in week 3 of our sermon series called Out of Nowhere. And we've been diving into the story of a man named Joseph, which is found in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50. And we're seeing what we can apply to our own lives when we find ourselves in circumstances that we never saw coming. And what we'll discover this morning is that Joseph was a man very familiar with waiting. Let's do a quick recap of Joseph's story thus far. At age 17, Joseph was his dad's favorite, but that only got him thrown into a pit. 10 of his brothers wound up selling him into slavery for a whopping $187. That's about $18 a piece. As Joseph's abilities became evident to Potiphar, who's the Egyptian official who had purchased Joseph as a slave, He found himself rising to a position second only to that of his master. However, like we saw last week, Joseph's refusal to have an affair with Potiphar's wife resulted in false charges and his imprisonment in Potiphar's prison. And that's where we're going to pick up our story today. Joseph is stuck in prison for doing the right thing, but God had not abandoned him. In fact, take a look at Genesis 39, beginning in verse 20. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Just like in Potiphar's house, God grants Joseph favor, so much so that those in charge of him promote him as much as they can, but he's still stuck in prison. He's waiting day after day for God to do something. I want you to take a look at what Warren Wiersbe says about Joseph's time in prison. He says, God permitted Joseph to be treated unjustly and put in prison to help build his character and prepare him for the tasks that lay ahead. The prison would be a school where Joseph would learn to wait on the Lord. He would learn that God's delays are not God's denials. It's like Sean talked about a couple of weeks ago. He referenced Malcolm Gladwell, who says that life often throws us desirable difficulties, these things that aren't fun at the time, but that make us better in the long run. Sean asked the question, how can you use your struggles as a springboard to success? And I thought that was so good. But let's be honest, waiting still stinks. It's like I said earlier, the question is, what do we do while we wait? So as we go through this portion of Joseph's story, I want to point out three answers that I see to that question during Joseph's time in prison in Genesis chapter 40. And the first answer is this: be consistent. I want you to take a look at Genesis 40, beginning in verse 1. It says, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with the two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Now, we don't know how long Joseph had been in prison when the cupbearer and the baker arrived. It could have been several days, it could have been several months. But what I want you to notice is Joseph's consistency. I mean, put yourself in Joseph's shoes here, okay? As far as he's concerned, this is just another day in prison. Even though he may be the leader of the prisoners, he's still a prisoner with no hope of getting out. He couldn't see into the future. The cupbearer would eventually be his ticket out, but he had no way to know that at the time, and it wouldn't come to pass for 2 more years. So what do you do when you're unjustly accused? What do you do when people that you trusted turn against you? What do you do when your dreams turn into nightmares? And even though all of those things were true for Joseph, he remained consistent. He stayed faithful to God and to his responsibilities. I came across this quote by a preacher named Mike Murdock. He says, "The secret of your future is found in your daily routine." The things that you do every single day, especially the little things that make up the routine of life, those are the seeds of your future that you sow every single day. Kind of reminds me of what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 10. He said, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Or in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., if it falls on your lot to be a street sweeper, then sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures, like Shakespeare wrote poetry, like Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper. Wherever he was, Joseph consistently gave it everything he had. I want you to think of it this way. Because God's hand was upon him, Joseph was promoted by the captain of the prison to be in charge of all the other prisoners. But because he was consistent, because he didn't ignore his job when these 2 new men entered the prison, what he was doing was he was unknowingly advancing the cause of his own freedom. Consistency is its own reward. So here's the question for all of us. Will we be consistent where we are, even when life seems to make no sense? we have to be consistent in the waiting. That's the first answer to the question. The second answer to the question, what do we do while we wait, is this. We have to be ready. Take a look at Genesis 40, verse 5 now. After they had been in custody for some time, there's that phrase again, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, were being held in prison, and they had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in the master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." And then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." There are dreams all through Joseph's story. First, he has them in Genesis 37, and then these two men have them in Genesis 40, and then Pharaoh will have a two-part dream in Genesis 41, which Sean is going to look at more next week. But in each case, these dreams prove crucial in Joseph's life. In Genesis 37, Joseph has dreams that he shares with his brothers that provoke their hatred even more. But in Genesis 40, the baker and the cupbearer turn to Joseph to help them interpret their dreams. I want you to think about this. How easy would it have been for Joseph to say, "Dreams, huh? My advice is, forget about those dreams. They don't mean anything. I had dreams of my own once, and look where I am now, guys." But even though many years had passed, even though he's endured rejection, enslavement, false accusation, imprisonment, he recognized that God still wanted to use him, and he was ready. Did you know that God does some of his best work in prison? The Apostle Paul goes to prison, and we get Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. John Bunyan goes to prison, and out comes the Pilgrim's Progress. Dietrich Bonhoeffer goes to prison, and we get the Cost of Discipleship. Chuck Colson goes to prison, and the worldwide ministry of prison fellowship is born. We serve a God who is not stopped by barbed wire and high walls. Prison doors can never keep him out. Maybe you feel like you're in a prison of sorts right now. You feel stuck or trapped or not sure of what it is you need to do next. It was the winter before I graduated from college, and I had one semester left. Autumn had already graduated. You could say I was taking a victory lap. And I had a very promising job opportunity at a church in a growing city in South Carolina. And I was going to be able to finish school online while I started working full-time in this position. So we got to the very last stage of the interview process, and we'd even put a deposit on an apartment. That's how sure we were getting the job. And at the last minute, the job fell through. And it felt like the rug was just pulled out from under us. No idea what we were going to do next. But given that I'd already worked it out to finish my remaining classes online, Autumn suggested that instead of moving back to where we were, that we move here to Northeast Ohio by her family for a few months while we kind of figured out what our next steps were. Now, I'm going to be honest. If I had experienced a Northeast Ohio winter, I would have said, heck no, it's not happening. But it seemed like a good next step at the time, so we moved into the apartments behind the Salem Hospital. And the only job that I could find in the area was working at Mark's grocery store in the produce department during the wee morning hours before the sun came up. I was working in a walk-in fridge and then walking outside to push carts through 6 inches of snow. Let's just say that Ohio and I were not off to a great start, okay? I was not loving life. And on top of that, I had these senior level papers that I'd get home and I'd have to write to finish my courses. And so I needed some Bible commentaries for this particular paper. I don't even remember what it was, but my father-in-law suggested that I go see this guy named Sean Kelly. Maybe you've heard of him. So I did. And I can remember about 9 years ago now, standing in what would eventually be a shared office, talking to Sean and grabbing some books off his shelf. And that was the only time that I talked to Sean during the season that we lived in Northeast Ohio. Now, fast forward a bit, Autumn and I felt called to minister in a small beach city in Southern California for the next 4 years. It's funny how Ohio winters have that effect on people. But 4 years later, I got a call from Sean who wanted to talk to me about maybe considering campus ministry in Northeast Ohio at Greenford Christian Church. He said, "Mark, ever since our interaction in my office 4 years ago, I went home and I looked at my wife, Corey, and I told her, I'd like to hire him someday." I guess you live and learn, right? But here's my point. Biting the bullet and being ready to do the job that I didn't want to do, or the jobs that I didn't want to do all those years ago, led me to what I would call my dream job today. And I wonder for you, what is it that you're doing or going through right now that isn't very fun, but that God might be using? Maybe it's a job that you feel stuck in. Maybe it's fighting with your spouse. Maybe it's an illness. Maybe a loved one is in prison. Maybe you lost your job due to COVID. Well, as we read Joseph's story, we need to ask ourselves this question. Like Joseph, are you ready to serve God right where you are, even when you'd rather be somewhere else? Be consistent. Be ready. And the final answer to what to do in the waiting is this. Be bold. You see, when you read Genesis chapter 40, you discover that Joseph tells the cupbearer that he will be released in 3 days and restored to his former position. That's in verses 12 and 13. No doubt he was delighted to hear the news. And then Joseph adds a personal request in verse 14. He says, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." Now, some Bible teachers have called this a lack of faith on Joseph's part, as if he isn't trusting God by trying to take matters into his own hands. Well, I got to tell you, I don't agree with that at all. See, if Joseph has been unfairly treated, and if he's not guilty, which he isn't, then why shouldn't he seek his release? In the words of a preacher that I heard recently, if I were in prison, and if a buddy of mine were about to get out, I'd look to heaven and I'd say, "Your will be done." And then I'd turn to my buddy and say, "Help get me out of here." And we all understand that if you're in prison, you want to get out as soon as you can. And in Joseph's case, he truly hadn't done anything wrong. On the one hand, he's faithful and he's ready to serve God where he is. On the other hand, he doesn't want to stay in prison forever. It's as if he's saying, "Listen, I'm here, but this is not my whole life. I accept where I am for the moment, but I hope to be set free eventually." And 2 years later, his request would lead to his release. And I don't think Joseph ever regretted what he said. The whole episode reminds me of a scene from the movie Shawshank Redemption with Andy Dufresne, who was falsely accused of murdering his wife and her lover. And he was talking with his friend Red in the prison yard. And they were discussing Andy's hope of getting out someday when Red says, essentially, "Man, you got to give that up. Look at us. We're never getting out of here." And Andy pauses for a moment, and then he says this. Comes down to a simple choice. Get busy living or get busy dying. So many people lose hope. And when hope is gone, life's over. But Joseph didn't settle. Instead, he said to the cupbearer, "Remember me." He was consistent in prison. He was ready in prison. He was bold in prison. What do you do while you wait? You be consistent, you be ready, you be bold. Genesis 40:23 gives us the end of the story. It says, "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." That's a bummer, isn't it? After all that, the cupbearer forgets Joseph. But that happens all the time in life. We make promises that we don't keep. We intend to stay in touch, but we don't. We plan to call an old friend, but we don't. And when the cupbearer got out, he promptly left the prison far behind. And Joseph must have had so many questions. What if the cupbearer never remembers? What if I die in this prison? What if I never get to clear my name? I'll tell you, the what ifs of life will kill you. What if I lose my job? What if he never asks me out for a second date? What if I never get married? What if I can't have children? What if things don't work out? What if I run out of money? What if I lose my job again? What if our children get sick? What if we can't find a place to live? What if the contract falls through? What if I don't get accepted? What if the chemo doesn't work? What if she files for divorce? I want you to put yourself in Joseph's place here. The only people who can help him think he's dead, or they think he's committed this vile crime, or they've forgotten him completely. Well, what do you do then? Well, it all depends on how big your God is. How big is your God when you've been betrayed and enslaved and falsely accused and imprisoned and forgotten? God never hurries. Joseph's experience in prison reminds us that God doesn't keep time the way that we do. Psalm chapter 90, verse 2 says that he is from everlasting to everlasting. 2 Peter 3:8 tells us that with the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like one day. Time is no complication to God. A.W. Tozer said it this way. He said, God never hurries. There are no deadlines against which he must work. God's bigger than the clock. He's never in a hurry. He's never late. He's never behind schedule. Even though the cupbearer forgot Joseph, God didn't. So he kept waiting well. He was consistent. He was ready. He was bold. Take a look at this incredible promise for those of us who wait on God. It's found in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Help is on the way. He's just not working on your schedule. Let God be God, and it'll all work out. I believe that sometimes God delays his blessing to examine what's in our hearts. He waits on purpose. And it's not that he doesn't want to bless you, but he's after a purpose that's greater than your immediate blessing. God doesn't want to just fix our problems. He wants to transform us in the process. So let me ask the key question one more time. Are you willing to wait for God? This sermon ends where it began, with Joseph in prison, falsely accused, unjustly imprisoned, alone and forgotten. Apparently, he's hit a dead end. The story's over, or so it seems. But stay tuned, because God's still writing Joseph's story. In fact, he's about to meet the most powerful man in the world. And maybe, just maybe, God isn't finished writing your story yet either. The question is, what will you do in the waiting?